Thank you so much for your patience. This is one of my favorite panels I probably will ever moderate, especially because of that setting, especially because of the time that we're living in. My name is David Dao. I'm the co-founder of GainForest, which is an NGO that preserves biodiversity data around the world. We work with local communities. And today's topic is very much about data, about seed banks of data. Seed banks, some of you might know the term, is seed banks are used to preserve the biology, the seeds of all the plants of the world in case something goes wrong and we need to replant in agriculture. And we do see that need for data, specifically climate data. Mark has done a really great job from the Internet Archive issuing out the concern that we're seeing, the times we're living in, where data is not long-term, but very much short-term. And even archives that we believe are federal and state-governed are not lasting. So how do we, in terms of data that is fluctuant, preserve and create seed banks that preserve really important issue data? And the one issue data that we really want to nail down today is climate data. And I'm joined by an esteemed panelist. I couldn't be happier with my three fellow panelists that are all world-class in what they are doing at the intersection of climate change, data, and the frontier of decentralized data provenance. So I would like to introduce Maria Sousa, from Executive Director of Climate Change AI, Alan Ransil, co-founder of Cherty and Devonian AI, and Marie-Claire, who is leading the Youth Negotiators Academy, training many, many negotiators at the climate change COP conferences. So I'll give you a word, like 1 or 2 sentences to introduce yourself, and then we dive straight into the topic.
Okay, thank you very much, David. I'm Maria João Sousa, and as David mentioned, I serve as Executive Director of Climate Change AI, and I'm also a postdoc at Cornell Tech's Public Interest Technology Initiative. Climate Change AI is a nonprofit that started about 5 years ago because we were seeing a lot of climate data becoming available. Machine learning was becoming a bit more useful than it used to be. And so there was an opportunity to create a community at this intersection. And today we really empower a global community of innovators, practitioners, and decision makers to accelerate responsible climate action using AI. And we address gaps in expertise, education, research to deployment infrastructure, and a lot of coordination within this community.
I'm Alan. I, as David said, started a company called Devonian that's building a set of reporting tools for carbon and nature projects. And so we use Web3 for what Web3 is really good at, the underlying data that backs up reports, things like feasibility studies or monitoring reports for tree planting projects or biodiversity projects. And then we use LLMs and AI for the things that they're really good for using that data and filling in the actual human readable sections of these reports. And what we're trying to do with that is really speed up the rate at which people can start new climate projects, things like tree planting or tree forest preservation and biodiversity projects, and lower those barriers so people can take more climate action. And I'm also an advisor to the Filecoin Foundation on sustainability and the carbon emissions associated with the Filecoin network itself.
Thank you. And my name is Marie-Claire, as David already mentioned. I'm coming more from the governance side. We are training and enabling young people from around the world to take part in democratic processes at the United Nations on multilateral environmental diplomacy. And to just stick with the analogies, we are basically enabling young people from around the world and enabling countries to kind of like use these seed banks of data to then make better informed policies. And I think like in the area of not only deletion of policies, but also in erasure of democratic principles and partaking in democratic processes, I think it's more important than ever that we're building an ecosystem which is like intertwined and really rooted in its decentralized approach.
Marie-Claire, the first question goes to you. So you have been involved in the Rio Conventions. These are the 3 conferences that the world meets on to discuss about climate, desertification, and about biodiversity. You have been in that process for a very long time, I think more than 7 years, as a negotiator, but also training these negotiators now. Can you give us a little bit of an insight why we talk about climate data today? Like, what is the connection between data and climate change and our efforts to prevent climate change, and why should we even care?
Well, big questions to start with. We could probably spend the whole day, and I hope I do not have to convince the room how absolutely urgent it is that we all step up our game when it comes to environmental topic, when it comes to biodiversity loss, when it comes to climate change. We all feel it. But I think there is a new layer, and with our data getting more and more accurate and our tools are getting better at forecasting, like there's really no excuse to not act, right? And I think we all have to like do much more to really like step up our game. Yet I also think it's really important that we are, again, taking the analogy with the seed banks, that when we have data, like who has been creating this data, what biases are there, who has been not engaged in the data kind of process, looking into how indigenous groups in territories, how we have like whole huge gaps where there is no data. Because only when we actually have a good data map and a much better sampling of data, we can actually deviate policies which ultimately help all of us to get better. And I think like why it is important, I think we all are steered by the common aim to have a livable future for future generations. And we are unfortunately fast track to not get there with the current models. Maybe like just like one number, right? I mean, like there is, when we look into data inequality, 85% of the data, biodiversity data is currently from the global north, whereas most of the hotspots on biodiversity are in the global south. So obviously, like when we don't have the data, very often it's kind of like a very weak element to basically erode these biodiversity hotspots around the world. It's very hard to preserve it. It's very hard to make policies out of it. And I think there we can all do better. And with the technologies we are all engaged in and building, and with the focus on public goods, I think we really can steer up and support so many more communities to get the data sets, to then get the policies, so we can all steer in the right direction together.
A quick follow-up on this. Do you think politicians act on top of data-driven, or do you think data serves a certain kind of pressure tool for politicians to act, or would they act without the data itself?
Well, yes and no. There are these politicians and these politicians, right? I do think that having very solid data sets is helping a lot in the advocacy, especially also for example, for NGO groups, for investigative journalism. And we have seen over and over again how the pressure has been translating into policies. We also know that there are a lot of environmental ministers, head of climate change office who deeply, deeply care about these topics. And they also need the data, that they can prove to the financial department that we need to implement this, we need to protect this area, right? And it's not only like kind of like I feel or I heard, which is also a very important component, yet we also have the underlying data. And I think all of this really helps to either unmask what's being done or to support what should be done. And again, we all can do much better in kind of being informed citizens, voting for people who actually take care and have data-informed and evidence-based policies.
Nice. So just for the other panelists, in case you want to respond or answer to any of your discussions, feel free to do so. This is meant to be a conversation. But I want to move a little bit now from the human and the data to the machine and the data. So Mariette, you're leading climate change AI, and the two terms are already giving up my question, spoiling it. So how important is data in terms of decision-making from machines? How important is that climate data when it comes to artificial intelligence research? What do we see how those two soundly very distant disciplines are connected?
Yeah, that's a great question, David. And as David spoiled it, I lead climate change AI, the two things that are more imminently going to kill us. So maybe bundling them together will help. We're trying to do so we'll see. Definitely data, like I think one of the first things that computer science would learn when they would start to look at machine learning would be, garbage in, garbage out. Now we see scenarios where a bit less data curation can yield better results than maybe 10 years ago, but it's still very much the quality of data a great concern in this space. And we at Climate Change AI have worked a lot on both trying to build incentives for people within our community to bridge some of these gaps. So 4 years ago, we started a program that was trying to bridge those research to deployment infrastructure gaps that we created an innovation grants program that was funding particularly the creation of data sets, tools, or simulators that then would enable the community to work on these problems, because in many cases the data wasn't there at all. It's not on the internet in many cases, and a lot of the machine learning develops have been built on building models that are very good at parsing information that is structured in a particular way. And if you start to look at addressing climate change from mitigation, adaptation, and even climate science problems, all within all the sectors that intersect with this, be it power sector, be it the biodiversity, be it transportation, be disaster management and relief, all of these communities sort of deal with data, right? But they all deal with data with different ways, with different taxonomies. And so it is a very hard work to bring that to structures that then machine learning can be applied to. And that program sort of it started to create incentives for the community to rally around building those data sets. And more recently, we have started to look more at what are the data gaps. And so we develop or started to develop a repository of what are meaningful data gaps that we need to address. And the taxonomy as it evolved has particularly focused on things that are critical that we see and are cross-cutting across domains, right? Sometimes the gap is usability. Sometimes it's the reliability of the data. Sometimes it's we need to measure things that are not observable or measurable directly, and we need proxies for it. So it is definitely a complex problem. And it's not just like for researchers to address, right? Like it's the utilities, is the practitioners and domain experts that are dealing with this data every day that play a role in bringing this data to the fore.
From a technical perspective, oh, Alan, you wanted to address?
Yes.
Yeah.
Could I just jump in really quickly about this question between this question about the link between sort of data and decision making and politics, right? Like as someone who's spent a lot of time in academia, I have to believe that you can use data to change people's minds, because I don't know where we are without that. And I want to speculate a little bit that in the past, one of the reasons that it was difficult to use data on climate to change people's minds is that the world around them wasn't obviously changing. And so in the 90s, when you held up these curves showing the concentration of CO2 going up, or these data sets that were pretty clear if you're a scientist, even at that point, that the world is getting warmer. It didn't feel right to people, right? Like it was way too easy for people in the 90s to say, well, it's kind of fine. Like, all right, we have some warmer days, but like it doesn't like feel like the world is changing that much. And I feel like we're at a point right now, which is exactly where the science said we were going to be right now. We're sort of at this tipping point where it's really obvious to people all of the sudden, right? It's obvious because hurricanes are getting worse. It's obvious because heat waves are getting worse, because LA is burning down. There are flash floods. David, you grew up in Germany. There have been like insane floods in Germany over the past few years that no one would have expected. And I feel like there's that like gut sense that the world actually has changed, that is growing in people and is going to get more intense, right, and more urgent. And I feel like that's where data can be really powerful, right? When you're telling people a story that feels correct to them, and then you also have the data to back it up, I think that's how you can really change people's minds, which I think is why we're at such a crucial moment right now, where it's really important that we preserve these data sets, right? That these data sets are disappearing off of US government websites rapidly, like you just heard about from the Internet Archive. And we need to keep that data so we can, as people's gut feeling that like something is changing fundamentally about the Earth's ability to support our type of society, we need to preserve these data sets sort of now more urgently than ever.
Maybe I have a quick follow-up to that. I think there's a moment for everyone that it becomes obvious that this is happening. but that moment is not for everyone at the same time. So one of the challenges is this haha moment about climate happens to people around the world at different points. It's not like, for instance, COVID, that it became obviously and sort of there was like this collective effort simultaneous, and climate sort of it takes the years, sometimes decades, for some of these effects to play, and those effects also are very sparse geographically distributed, sparsely distributed geographically, and so it's a bit more hard for that collective effort to emerge naturally. Yeah.
So we already heard the importance of data in human decision making, changing people's mind, and also for artificial intelligence algorithms to make informed decisions. Now, as we are seeing data being deleted in an unprecedented way, not just in this term, but also in the previous term of the current administration, we are seeing dangerous consequences of, due to the fact that our society and our actions depend on that data, what happens if we rug pull basically society from that data, right? It's really important to now address the concerns and maybe hopes and ideas of building a seed bank for this data. I think the Internet Archive has been an amazing place, perfect place to host this panel to discuss how we can build a better library, how we can build a better seed bank, how we can preserve this really essential data. So, Alan, you've been building on decentralized data infrastructure for a while already at Filecoin and now with your company. Could you give us a little bit like a can you nerd snipe us a little bit about what technology is out there to help us preserve this data in a more decentralized way?
Yeah, 100%. And I think that I may be preaching to the choir in a church, which, maybe is a good place to be. But when we use Web 2 tech, the problem with that, the deep and fundamental problem, is that we are addressing data based on where it is, not what it is. And then the Trump administration can give you a 404 error when you try to access this data set that is really important to you. The data set probably exists still somewhere in the world, but you can't find it because the link that you have goes to a place on a server that data is supposed to be, which means that if someone moves that data, if someone makes that server unavailable, if someone corrupts that data, right, you could worry about actors going in. I'm not sure that the Trump administration is sophisticated enough to do this yet, but you can imagine them going in and just like not deleting data sets, but changing them to make their point. Actually, they use Sharpies, right? That's how they do it. They just redraw the past of hurricanes, right? Yeah. So the point is, if you address data based on where it is, then the person who controls the server where it's supposed to be has all the power, and you have absolutely no recourse if they change that data set or move that data set or make it unavailable. The core realization of data management in Web3 that underlies IPFS and underlies sort of a lot of the philosophy around how we work with data is that if you address data based on what it is, then you suddenly are able to take advantage of this universal coordinate system for data provided to us by hash functions that gives us the ability to access that data no matter where it is in the world, as long as it's connected to a decentralized network, and prove that data set is the data set that we requested. And so this is how content addressing works. You don't, that random looking string of letters and numbers that you use to address data on IPFS, for example, is the output of a hash function run on that data set that lets you search for that data no matter where it is, no matter what server it's on the IPFS network, and then verify that it is indeed the data set that you wanted. And so, I think that's a fundamental set of primitives that is totally necessary if we are going to take data and preserve it beyond the lifetime of the goodwill of a particular set of stewards, right? You actually can verify that this data set is being preserved over the world over time, because you're tying it to the digital fingerprint of that data, not just that location.
So building the seed bank requires, of course, on one hand, technology, but it requires, on the other hand, agency, humans that want to build this, and also access to the data sources. Marie-Claire, you've been working with the UN for a while now. Do you think the UN will use IPFS to store their climate data?
Well, they have to. And there is actually like now like a lot of effort to digitize the old data, the old decisions, because basically like they have been around since the 80s, and they still have like a huge archive of paper print documents, which we cannot currently access, right? And as I mentioned, we are training young negotiators to partake in these processes, and it's pretty challenging for them to go into the history because basically everything stops around like the 2000 years, and they cannot like dig into the history which happened before. So I think like the UN really needs to digitize and archive their data to make it more accessible. And additionally, I think we also have to build on these data sets on how they can be like more easily be accessible, how they can be like used better for not only decision making, but also for building your own opinion, right? Because so the latest so there, on climate change, there is the so-called IPCC, this is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. You might have heard of it. The US has also been withdrawing their participants, their scientists who have been working in this council. So basically, it's a global council of climate scientists who are bringing all the science and make kind of like a state-of-the-art report, an assessment report, and they just published the last one. And it's thousands and thousands of pages, right? And this is the summary of what they have been doing. I mean, I have read it, but I mean, I'm not going to ask anyone else to read this. And I think also like it's not really like smart to read it. But I think like we can really use kind of technology and agentic AI to build on top of these tools to make the data more accessible and to also make it more user-friendly. So it actually can inform us that we can actually take evidence-based and scientific-based decisions, because we always talk about it, but it's really, really hard because it's exceeding our human capacity to read through all of this different data and then to have like the lens of, oh, well, there is also indigenous data which we haven't even grasped. So how do we go there? So I know that David, you have been working on an AI assistant for indigenous data. We have been working on an AI assistant it's called Polly, to support negotiators to read through documents, to read through the science, to better understand quite quickly what it is about, and if it is identify the right documents to then really dig into. And all of this is, I think, like really like a compass and navigation through what is there, because I think like in the vastness of all the data we have, we need some compass. Otherwise, we are kind of like being flooded and it's exceeding our capacity to actually take the good decisions. So we are not achieving our goal, right? And I think with the technology and especially also the AI agentic move which is coming up, we have to make use of it. So we are on the forefront of the good development of what these agents can do.
That's really interesting. How the Trump administration right now is currently preventing us from accessing data is actually in a threefold strategy. Number one, it of course deletes the data set. Number two, it potentially keeps the data set, but it restricts legal access to the pages. And number three is actually to make it just super hard to find by digging it deep into a website. So those three different kind of like barriers that they are building up on the data sets, how do you see potentially technologies such as AI or other fields can change what Marie-Claire said, making it more accessible, making us filter through the information explosion, but also making sure that we find the data that we want to archive?
Yes, thank you for the question. Definitely, I think within the AI for climate community, now with this change in administration, that have been several efforts at trying to protect that data, and it would be great that these kind of adversarial sort of environments didn't have to emerge for people to rally about around some of these issues. But definitely, it's I think it sort of propels people to join forces in many ways to preserve that data. I think also we have seen, or at least I beyond the AI for climate community, I think the civic tech community is also looking a lot at these issues and trying to preserve that data, and also build interfaces for people to have access to that data. We have this great example of the Internet Archive and the Wayback Machine. That is a great interface that anyone with any level of literacy can use. And in dealing with climate, I work closely with the AI community, but often technologies alone won't solve anything, right? The policymakers alone won't solve anything. Developers alone won't solve everything, right? And so it's creating interfaces that people can access the data in ways that they need, like policymakers will need the data in particular ways. AI developers will want them in machine readable ways. And often machine learning can also be a tool that can be used to distill that raw data and embed those solutions in those kind of interfaces. One great example that I always give is Climate Trace, which is a platform that is using a lot of AI to map global greenhouse gas emissions, and is using a lot of AI to measure that information and make it available for any kind of application, be it in machine learning, but also in policy making as well. Yeah.
Can I just tag in on there really quick? I think that, yeah, like you're saying, like building these interfaces and tools to allow people to easily access those data sets and know what to do with them. And as you were saying, very clear too, like building, we have this sort of exploding new set of tools that can really improve those interfaces and like make a huge difference. I think the other thing, I'd add a fourth layer to this strategy that you're talking about, David, which is just like firing all of the people that are updating those data sets and using those data sets, right? If you are interested in public goods funding and sort of the history of public goods funding, I'd really point you back to this short book written by Vannevar Bush after World War II called Science, the Endless Frontier. And we've gotten a huge amount of benefit out of this idea that Vannevar Bush had, which was that we had, in World War II, we had built up the capacity to do a lot of science and engineering very quickly. And we had sort of changed the paradigm from the system, the world that had come before, which was where private companies and individuals had to basically fund research, to this world where, because we had to fight World War II and we had to build radar and atomic physics and all this stuff, we had built up this massive capacity to do science and fund that using the federal government, right? And it's been the most successful mechanism for funding public goods in the history of the world. And many of the advances in medicine and in tech and computers, like all of the stuff that we rely on, batteries certainly. I come from energy. That's all been the consequence of this like great vision that Vannevar Bush had, and the direction that I would really like to go in, right, is one in which public goods funding is such that if you are interested in working on something that could push the boundaries of human knowledge, you're just going to be able to do that as your job. And I think that we should, go farther in that direction, right? And it seems like we're going in the opposite direction right now.
Yeah. Seed banks are also a symbol of hope, right, for humanity, because in case of, it connects so well to climate change. In times of disaster, we always have hope that long-term, the next generation can use the knowledge that we created. So in that way, I would like to open up questions from the audience to the panelists. If there are any questions, open up the discussion from basically the panel to the church and back. Any other questions? If not, I have one more question to all panelists. So data, oh yeah, please.
Thank you. I'm curious how open data and this idea of data seed banks can be wired together to create funding mechanisms, particularly for grassroots communities and indigenous communities who are already doing this work.
You guys want me to address this question?
Yes, I think you're the perfect person.
So GainForest, the NGO that I started 7 years ago, we pay people for conservation data. we kickstarted by paying them for Starlink access, because that is a human right, we believe, to have access to broadband. And then based on that, we teach them essential basic skills of initial small sensor, like a bioacoustic sensor, to collect bioacoustic data. And every time they do this in a certain part of the world, they're the very first person who ever collected this data set. That's very valuable for science, for decision making, for empowerment of the community, for feeling proud that they're a part to support the scientific consensus and knowledge. And we pay them. Currently, it's governed through a small endowment fund that we were able to raise by winning the X Prize. And that endowment fund pays them 1 cent per minute of bioacoustic recording and 5 cents per megabyte of drone data imagery from the forest. That pricing is determined through the communities themselves. They know exactly how much money we can give out through the interest. It's a predictable outcome. It's a little bit like a small octant for the people who know octant here in this community that pays it out. So call out, great project. And yeah, this really helps onboard the communities and connect them to the digital world. We believe there's so much opportunity with the data economy to trickle down the wealth from the global north to the global majority.
Can I do a really quick plug too, which is that if you're interested in this topic, Filecoin is about to do a workshop on preserving climate data. Sarah's going to lead that downstairs.
Yes, there's one more question here, please. Then I think we are almost out of time.
This is more of an observation, or I guess a question for Alan. Hi, Alan.
How's it going?
There's an assumption among all the panelists that data is somehow generic, that data sets can be mixed. And I worry a lot when I hear people talk in the blockchain space, and certainly Web3, about aggregating data that strips out the identity of how the data was originally gathered and who gathered it and what their confirmation biases were. And it's interesting, when you talked about the value of data, you talked about fires in LA, and you suddenly switched over from a climate data set mentality to a qualitative measurement analogy, talking about qualitatively the value of expressing the impacts of something. And I think that's the challenge with all of this. How do you reconcile qualitative with quantitative data, especially since what you're doing is essentially stripping out the core identity of that data when it's put onto these chains?
Yeah, I'd love to kind of talk with you after maybe and understand what you mean a little bit more. I think that when we are addressing data based on this digital fingerprint, the goal of that is to preserve the integrity of that data. And that's sort of a hook that you can hang provenance information on that I think, addresses some of what you're talking about. But I'd love to have a longer conversation about that.
Well, wonderful. We hope that we gave you a little bit of hope and a direction of building a seed bank for data. Hope is very rare nowadays in these times, but I do believe data, technology, and human are the right way to steer forward that. Thank you so much, panelists, for this wonderful discussion, and they are available here today as well to talk to.
Thank you, David.